Okay, this is actually going to be a fairly long episode, even though it's going to focus on a relatively small part of the game. I'm going to be discussing what at the time were my only two ongoing League games. One against Sotokaru, a historical opening, and one against wksp, a long opening. In one of those I was the Allies, in one of those I was the Axis. And in both of these we're going to be looking at beginning of the Endgame with a particular focus on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is enormously important in the Endgame. And in fact, the Endgame in general is really important in unconditional surrender, and I would recommend that it is one of the things you should focus on once you've got the basic rules down. And one of the best ways to do that on Board Game Arena is to play matches of the 1944 scenario, which sets up a historical endgame. Now, it's not a balanced scenario. That is definitely heavily favours the Allies, but it is really good for teaching you the basic principles that apply in the endgame. So we're going to start with my game against wksp. As I mentioned, this is a long opening, which involves delaying the first major conflict and invasion of the USSR until 1941, and thus the end of the game until 1946. I had a pretty good opening and a very good mid-game, and achieved everything I reasonably could. So in January 44, when the Soviets re-enter the war, I have a complete medlock, Kuwait, Egypt, Gibraltar, and I control the United Kingdom. I have 5 minor allies, which is not the best result I've had in this opening, but perfectly reasonable for the endgame. The US and the UK have been building up forces for a potential landing in 44. Because the Western forces are on the back foot, it is possible and necessary to make more of a fight on the Eastern Front. In the long opening, the Soviets get summer offensives in both 44 and 45. In other openings, the Soviets get only one summer offensive after a Moscow treaty. There are 15 hexes from the westernmost part of the treaty line to Posen, the easternmost factory of the main part of Germany. If the Soviets get past that point, if they can get into German production, that is usually a lost endgame. So in a typical summer offensive, an Axis player can afford to give 4 hexes each month, but not in the long opening. Here, you have to face 2 summer offensives. So you usually counterpunch in the long opening, which is generally speaking an error in the historical or East First. Here, you can see a breakthrough in the open ground in the centre in May. The gap hex is no longer protected by zone of control, so I can push units through, cutting off the 2 Soviet units west of Bryansk and beginning to roll up forces around Orel and Kursk. By June, push through the gap and encircle Kursk. The only significant Soviet force still holding out is in the south. It's worth saying a little about tactics in this situation. I don't need to make ground. It will be nice if I do, but I don't need to. The point is to kill enough Soviet units to eliminate sufficient combat power that they cannot advance against me. Once the units are killed, of course, it does permit you to advance, and in July I take Moscow, which, remember, is unfortified, so it's not as much of an achievement as it is in the initial invasion of the USSR. In the north, I divert significant forces to try and take Leningrad, which I achieve in September. Eliminating Leningrad helps create a much superior northern line for 1945, when I will not be able to spare enough combat power to counterpunch. And yeah, I've definitely overextended myself here. Turkey collapsed, so I need to begin to evacuate German forces from the Middle East. However, having connected my Scandinavian forces, I am returning the German first convoy to the UK. I want to be in a position to put up a serious fight if there is a landing there, which cannot be for a while due to no surprise markers. Impressive as German gains were on the Eastern Front, I was never able to make significant progress into the Caucasus, and the line at the restricted area is impossible to hold because you cannot project zones of control into the restricted zone. Current Soviet losses amount to 68 production points, so they'll be back at full strength by January. I should be able to shore up and hold on until the fair weather, and this gives plenty of room for a retreat across Russia in 45. If I can hold Rostov a turn, that will be the obvious site for the armour, then I would be able to give 30 hexes before reaching Germany. More than enough, even for the longest of summer offensives, though I will need to shore up Italy and the Balkans, which will undoubtedly prove a drain. In November, I managed to retake Stalingrad, which brings me to a much more stable position in the east. I'm protected by severe weather in the west, but Africa and Turkey are now completely lost. Let's discuss a tactical problem here. In February, I take a retreat southwest of Stalingrad. The Soviets played partisan for this. Couple of questions. Did you know this element would have a choice and would be allowed to retreat into Stalingrad itself? If not, that's an element of the rules you need to remember. You can always retreat into empty friendly cities, unless they are in the zone of control of the unit that's attacking you. Do you know where you should retreat to from here? Feel free to pause and think about it. The answer is that the unit needs to retreat into Stalingrad itself. If it retreats northwest, then the Soviet forces will be able to isolate the unit northeast of Stalingrad and assault it twice, potentially destroying that unit and beginning a cascade along the line. Anyway, before talking about the 45 summer offensive in the long game, perhaps a chance to switch sides and look at my endgame against Sutokahu, and in particular, Sutokahu's last full summer offensive with the Soviets. This is in essence a reversal of the situation I've just shown you. Here I'm playing as the Soviets in a historical scenario from a position that broadly seems to favour the Axis. Sutokahu opted for a counterpunch in May. The Axis have two real options. If they want to hold a line, they need to counterpunch. The alternative to that is to fall back. In this case, probably to the Dnieper River. There isn't really enough strength, in my opinion, to counterpunch. 2 panzers, 13 infantry and 9 others, but no significant air power. That's actually really important. In a counterpunch, what the Axis are looking for is generally to destroy Soviet units, and the tipping point seems to be around 6. If you get more than 6 Soviet units in the initial attack, that tends to be disruptive for the Soviet offensive. One of the tactical problems you need to consider as the Soviets in this situation is whether it is worth spending air or tanks to defend. Generally, you do it when a unit is early in its movement and the attacking unit would be forced into open ground, or it would create a hole in your line. So in this position, the attack on Bryansk is probably one where you don't need to worry. The unit will retreat east and retain a full line in difficult terrain. I lose a unit caught out on its own, but it does not create no enemy zone of control that will allow a breakthrough. But with this, the attack around Bryansk peters out. The problem, which is easy to illustrate around Rostov, is concentration of units. There are 3 infantry and 1 tank available here. They need to eliminate 3 units to create a breakthrough. The best place to start would be with the guard tank. If that unit could be dislodged, the tank to the southwest would be isolated and could then be destroyed. The problem is an unsupported infantry has no chance of doing that against a guard tank. You're better off striking at the infantry to the north or the standard tank to the south with the panzer, which are in the open, and you can achieve a +2 or +3 differential on the dice rolls. But even if you do that, you really need a DD to get the panzer through, and then some luck to kill cut-off units. The German counterpunch failed, and I held on to a reasonable amount of air, power and tank counters, so now I need to begin my attack. And this is important. The game can be won or lost here, because there can be a huge swing as a result. First, as I said, I think it was an error to counterpunch. I would personally have fallen back with the German forces to the Dnieper and thrown all the minor allies and garrisons into a thin skirmish line to slow down the offensive. The German line is strong, but I think the weakest point, given my own strength, is at Kharkov. I would hope to punch through the Yugoslav units, then kill the 2 surrounded German units to the northwest, using partisan markers if necessary. That would give me a gap of 3 hexes to push units through. And I've got a reasonable number of units in that section. So my first attack is the 4th Guard tank with air support. First from Rostov, as that is the most limited air unit. It only has 2 sorties left. I do need some luck. It is possible to bounce here, but I don't need a lot of luck. And I actually get 2 DDs in a row. Kill the German units to the northwest with a relatively small number of attacks. I don't even need the partisans. I get the last German unit using an assault with 2 units that came from behind the lines. The reason that I do that is to leave the 3 units at the front line with the maximum possible movement to exploit the breakthrough. The breakthrough creates the possibility of seizing Kiev and Dnipropetrovsk. This is an important tactical point. The German forces are usually more concerned on the Eastern Front with killing units and will forego gaining ground to do so. Opposite is usually true of the Soviets. The Soviets want to recapture cities. It cuts off supply and prevents the German forces from reforming their line. And of course, the cities, even if deep behind the German line, still provide supply to the Russian units that recapture them. So in this case, I'm going to use the guard units to seize both towns. Then I will use the shock army to cut the retreats of the units to the north. Another tactical point, it's more important to cut retreats than to make attacks. The shock army is going to be supplied from Kiev, which I will have captured, and the point is, pinned German unit can be finished off later once its supply fails. So that largely ends my breakthrough in the centre. In the north, I begin the attack southeast of Smolensk against the Italian unit. As at Kharkov, the danger of allowing minor Allied forces in the front line is apparent here. The chances of taking Smolensk directly are slim, but you do not need to. You just need to pin the German unit in place so that low supply will allow it to be eliminated on a subsequent turn. Okay, so here is a little puzzle to think about, since I think it's always useful to think about small actions. The 11th Guard has taken the Italian position and forced a retreat from the Yugoslav garrison, which is what was blocking the Italian retreat. There are now 2 choices for both players. The 11th Guard has 4 movement points left. The Yugoslav garrison has 2 choices for its retreat, and the 11th Guard will then have the choice of pursuing or not the Yugoslav unit. The answer is no. The 11th Guard should not pursue. It will lose its supply without gaining anything, and the Yugoslav unit should retreat to the difficult terrain. In the north, I used my last point of air power to take Veliki Luke. A last tactical point on this opening turn. Think about production points. I could launch more attacks in the north, but I'm all out of air power, out of tank markers, and there isn't enough weight to achieve much. And that, I think, is a common error. People spend all of their production points without considering whether it is worth the effort. In this case, those production points can be used to buy back air sorties to allow me to continue the attack in the next month. Overall, the theatre-wide position is bad for the Axis. Losses were 7 full and 5 minor units, and both panzers on this front are pinned. The Axis still have 6 full and 5 minor units mobile. That's enough to shadow box, but the position is a problem. All but one of the full units is in the north, and they cannot muster any serious force to counter the breakthrough at Kiev. Weather here is critical. If this were July, it wouldn't be so bad, but it's May, and if June is another fair weather turn, the collapse will be nearly total. Okay, so June turned out to be poor weather. That helps Sotokahu. I won't go into detail because this is mostly a retreat and my follow-up. I do succeed in a single breakthrough and I sack a unit in Romania. Let me talk about sacrifices. The 6th Guard will be out of supply, but that's fine. It will have enough movement to take Bucharest if it is not stopped, or Constantia if it is blocked. The Romanians only have 2 national will, so that will take them out of the war. The main point of sacks like this is that they force the Axis to reform their lines at the position you sack a unit rather than further forward. The Axis position is still a good. Spain, Italy, Vichy and Yugoslavia are adding a host of small units to the situation. The Germans have 72 national will, and they should be able to get a defence together before I actually get to Germany. I count 6 full-strength units on the front, plus 2 defending over the straits in Turkey that can retreat north to join in, and the possibility of a strategic move to bring up another. The front on the Sanauti line narrows to just 16 hexes, and only 4 to 5 Soviet units are actually ready to attack it at the moment. So this absolutely is recoverable, even with 3 full weather turns for me to operate in. July is a modest success. I break through and seize Königsberg in the north, and I pin the panzers in the south. But because of the distances involved, I'm not really able to exploit the holes I create at either end of the line. It will, however, force the German army to react on both fronts, burning more production points and preventing them from rebuilding lost units. Importantly, I'm now into the mild zone in both sectors. That's the very first objective the Soviets have in their last offensive. They need to get into the mild zone because the chances of getting fair weather are different in the mild and the cold zone. So if you get stopped still in the cold zone, you're probably going to lose 2 turns of fair weather in the final part of the endgame, and that is likely to be fatal. I use my strategic move to bring a unit from the successful Turkish offensive, which I haven't really talked about, to reinforce the defence of Königsberg. This is something you need to get habitually used to doing in the final Soviet offensives, as you are making a lot of ground, either because of breakthroughs or because the Axis retreat. Your strategic moves should be used offensively to push through and beyond breakthroughs. Yes, sometimes a unit's strategic move in this way is surrounded, cut off and destroyed. But as I already explained, when you sack a unit like that, it determines where the new line forms. Oops, I forgot to eliminate the Soviet Black Sea Fleet last turn. I will remember to do that this turn. That is an important thing. The Soviet fleet wants to be in the Baltic for the final part of the endgame to threaten landings on the German coast. So you need to voluntarily eliminate it and rebuild it in the north. The German forces withdraw to form a new line at Danzig and Lodz. Sotokahu is doing the right thing here, which is retreat and save production points where possible to rebuild. In this case, it doesn't do much good. That half-strength panzer at Danzig just isn't up to the job. In the south, the German forces are overstretched and out of position. The response here is very similar to the way I've played it in previous turns. I go round the German units, pinning them in place and pushing forward. The Germans are now down to 60 national will. All the German build was deployed against the Soviets, though it will take a turn before that looks like more than a group of garrisons. I missed an opportunity here. Could have slipped a unit through with a strategic move and seized a forward position on the coastal road. The turn begins with some bad luck for Sotokahu. The Afrika Korps fails to break out, achieving only a single DR result on the first guard. I wait to see where Sotokahu decides to make the line and whether they will fight for Posen or Vienna. And it becomes apparent that Posen is to be abandoned, but Vienna will be fought for. I will reach the Oder this turn, which is a major blow for the Axis. To explain why this is so important, we need to talk about factories. If Poland was conquered at the beginning of the game, then the Germans will usually have 15 factories. That is 6 more than the Allies can cancel out with strategic warfare. They also have economic reforms, which will be coming up to 9 as the final part of the endgame approaches, and can never be affected by strategic warfare. That economic reform means the Germans always have 14 to 18 production points minimum in the endgame. It's also why collapses of German forces in the mid-game are so much more dramatic, because they don't have that reserve of economic reforms to ensure that they get minimum production points. But they also will have 2 extra production points for every one of the surplus 6 factories they hold on to. And that difference matters. The Axis get 5 to 8 turns of bad weather over the winter. At the bottom end, that comes out at about 100 production points to work with. At the top end, about 200. Rebuilding the German forces is a huge investment to replace and repair all the damaged units, and critically, to rebuild the Luftwaffe. Something Sotokahu is not going to be in a position to do in this game. A full rebuild of the Luftwaffe costs 63 production points on its own. So that is why each factory you capture matters. And this is an interesting one to stop and think about. What is the correct sequencing against Posen? Should you attack the garrison or the Afrika Korps first? Feel free to pause and have a think about that. Okay, this one is a tricky one. The way I would think about it is this. Your objective is to take Posen. If Posen falls, the Afrika Korps will fall, either isolated this turn or out of supply on a subsequent turn. With tank and air, there is a 95% chance of overrunning Posen with an attack from the southeast. The chances are good, but not quite as good, of taking out the stronger Afrika unit. It has a point better DRM, and it takes 2 retreats to eliminate it. You don't want to be spending the air and tank assets on the largely irrelevant and expensive to activate Afrika Korps. You want those to be actually attacking the line the Germans have reformed. I managed to dislodge 1st Panzer from Stettin, putting me just 2 hexes from Berlin. And by the end of September, I am pretty much along the banks of the Oder and am just a few hexes from Vienna in the south. The German forces are stretched thin. As you see, in this full position, the Western forces have not achieved the same level of success. In particular, they failed to take the factories on the Western German border, which would have been ideal, which is one of the main objectives for the Western forces when they land. They were facing a relatively strong German resistance. They were a little bit out of position as a result of the Med lock and the time it took to break that. Obviously, the big question from here is how much fair weather the Allies are going to get. Potentially, they could have one more turn of offensive in October or November, and they could have 1 to 4 turns of fair weather in 1945. And that is the element which almost always determines the outcome of the game. You can essentially think of what comes next as consisting of 2 parts. A rebuilding phase, the question being how complete the German rebuilding is going to be before a final offensive begins, and the final offensive in the last turns of the game. The more fair weather turns you get, the shorter the rebuilding phase, so both the weaker the German army and the greater the Allied attack. So it's very swingy. The Germans here have 50 national will, which is pretty good. Yes, their position on the Western Front is not a bad one. Their position on the Eastern Front is not as good. That's about 4 or 5 hexes further than you would ideally like the Soviets to get in the final full summer offensive. So it's still an uphill battle for the Allies to win this. But if I get 5 turns of fair weather, or even 4 turns of fair weather, I should fairly easily take Germany out of the war. If I only get 1 or 2, then there's no way I'll be able to take Germany out. 3, I think, favours the Axis, but it has possibilities both ways. Now, a little bit of editorialising. This is a problem with the game. The designers are now changing how the ending works, so instead of 1 to 5 turns, the range is going to be 1 to 3, so a less dramatic shift. However, fundamentally, I think the problem that needs to be addressed is the gap between bad weather and fair weather being quite so dramatic. There just isn't a good historical justification for just how dramatic the difference in the game is. But that's the end of the first part of the endgame against Sotakahu, and for now, here endeth the lesson.